This interview is sponsored by the Baylor University Program in Oral History, and today we're talking with Reverend M.L. Cooper, who's pastor of the Second Baptist Church in Waco. This is our fifth interview with Reverend Cooper. Today is August the 19th, 1980. It's approximately 9:30 in the morning. My name is Dan McGee. I'm a professor of religion here at Baylor. Reverend Cooper, we have dealt with the civil rights era in Waco as you viewed it as the pastor of a significant church in this city. There's a special aspect of this whole question of race relations in the Southwest, and that is the place of the Mexican American community and its leaders. Tell us what you recall about the emergence of the Mexican American community and some of its leaders in the civil rights struggle, and especially as they related to the black community and the leaders in the black community.
Sort of during the thrust of the civil rights program, which with blacks could have taken on a new height, that you've had the struggle for maybe a number of years in various forms. You did have rising in the late 60s and the 70s, the Mexican Americans, Latin Americans, either one as we refer to them, we had a sort of a civil rights thrust on their part. I think they became conscious as a group that something would need to be done as relates to their striving to take a more positive. Now, they had been accepted, which could have sort of diluted their thrust prior years. Could have been one of the factors. I wouldn't say maybe the only factor, but they had been accepted more or less as part of the first class, in that they were allowed to go to schools and participate here and there in some of the things that blacks had been positively denied.
Mm-hmm.
But they woke up to find out that maybe they were not as involved in the as a race, and so they moved up and moved out in a more positive way, and they began to take some organizational efforts and some organizational positions. And of course, during that time, they did reach out, recognizing their problems, along with somewhat parallel to our problems, that there could be an area where we could share maybe our strength together, and in limited ways, I would say, as I see it and as I experienced it in limited ways. Some efforts were made, but what maybe saddened me in the little experience of the area where I worked, they were quite new at the civil rights type of struggle, and they became divided, and this is what we discovered. So there were times we realized their problem to be very similar to ours in some nature, but that it would not maybe serve too great a purpose, our uniting with them with their position being so divided.
How do you explain the division within the Mexican American community, or were you ever able to explain it in your own mind?
I was never able fully to explain it. Maybe the only little analysis, limited analysis that I would come up with is that they had not had to unite in this way for some of the things that we had longed since had to unite for. They had been going to school. They had been accepted here and there in various positions. So this was a new lifestyle for them. We've been a part of the American culture, but we had the line had been drawn in a definite way. So our movement had been a struggle through the years, and leaders here and there, black, had sort of gotten it together, and the blacks realized that our position is a common one. It's common. What hurts one here or there is a hurt that all of us face. And every now and then, maybe a few would have it better at one place or another, but here again, our plight was common as over against theirs. So this is one of the things that I have sort of analyzed to be a part of their problem.
Do you recall any conflicts between the Mexican-American community or its leaders and the black community and its leaders during this time?
I don't remember any conflicts per se, but I never did see too much the kind of togetherness. There could have been spots where we had some little conflicts of ideals and goals. Maybe goals were the same, but the methods to get there could have been, but nothing grave or great in this respect. And of course, you find this even among the race of
Sure.
blacks. Sometimes the goals are the same, but one would want to use one method and one would want to use another method.
Did you have opportunity to work directly with any of the leaders in the black community, in the Mexican-American community during this time? Are there any of them that you remember in any special way and would characterize their leadership? I remember, for example, that there was a period in which a man who later ran for governor, Mr. Ramsey Muniz, was providing at least leadership of at least a segment of the Mexican-American community in
Right.
Waco. Did you know him?
I did get to know him, but we never did necessarily work too close together. I did serve on the UAC board, as maybe has been mentioned in our conversation. I had a chance to meet with several there in the meetings and discuss some of the problems that we were trying to solve as the UAC board. But that was somewhat on a limited basis.
All right. Let's talk about the development of black political leadership in Waco. Now, I recognize that it's not easy to separate out leadership in any community between political and religious and economic, and indeed some of the more visible political leaders in the black community in Waco were also leaders in the church community and others. But let's talk about the development of that black leadership, beginning, if you will, with or maybe there's a better place to begin. You tell me. Beginning with the election of the first black to the city council of Waco. Would that be the place to begin, or some other place?
It started before that, because I may say that after the law, I wouldn't know what year it became available where blacks were considered, along with other citizens, as having the right to vote.
Right.
But there was a period somewhat humorous to us, and yet it was serious to us at the same time. We had the right to vote, but many times we were overlooked by candidates. Accidentally, one may hand you a card, but they didn't make any efforts to come to the black community. So the Marvin Griffin and New Hope and I, maybe it was sort of his brainstorm and ours as we worked together in these types of things, civil rights movement and what have you. And a few other leaders got together, and Marvin and I decided to run as write-ins. We got together on a weekend. We said, look, the black community is being overlooked. No candidates come to us to ask for our votes. So why don't we run as write-ins? And he ran in the ward. However, it was sections at that time. We've gone through so many changes. He ran in that section, and I ran in this one, and we announced it. We got together on a Friday before the election, the coming Tuesday, and we announced it in our churches that Sunday. And to our great surprise, enjoyable surprise, we picked up better than 500 votes in each ward as write-ins. It was just mentioned through the pulpits and through the black community. And this shifted. That was enough votes to throw one or two in and one or two out in terms of percentage. So this was somewhat maybe the first thrust.
Yes, I was not aware of this. Now, what year was that? Do you recall?
I have a clipping at home.
Okay.
I can't recall. That clipping is in my
You
file.
can add that later then.
Yeah, all right.
To the
I'd be glad
manuscript.
to. I need to keep that in mind.
All right.
And of course, this changed the picture. Because we would have been surprised we'd won, but we ran a good race as write-ins. And from then on, there was this movement then of blacks moving out, and candidates really sort of looking towards this voting potential that they had overlooked, that really maybe caused one to win and another one to lose, which could have gone another way. Then we had a voters' league. We were part of a really voters' league, and we began to, I guess this gave us a kind of a thrust, and it stimulated the community as to our potential.
Was this a formal organization, the Voters
Yes.
League?
Yes.
And it was organized after?
No, this was really organized before.
Before.
Yes.
Was this Voters League organizationally independent from the NAACP?
Yes.
All right.
It was, and Marvin Griffin headed it up.
He was the elected leader of that.
Right.
Who were other leaders in that organization, do you recall?
We had several of our other pastors, Hardy, who was the pastor in First Baptist, and you had some who were maybe more regular in attendance than others, but it was supported by, I would say, the general leadership. It had its support from the general leadership by way of sponsors, and a number of our laymen.
I was going to ask if any laymen were very active in that.
Yes, we had laymen who were active.
Do you recall any of the ones who?
Well, I may just mention Vivienne Mays.
Yes.
Yes. She was a member of New Hope, and she was very valuable in terms of helping to sort of get it together, if we could use that expression. I can't recall maybe many other personalities that stood out because we had just a good group who were.
All right. After your write-in efforts showed the black community that they had some power.
Right.
How did things develop? There was then the election of the first black member of the city council. About what year would that have been?
Should have been the early 70s or
Late 60s, I
late
believe.
60s. You're right,
I believe.
late 60s.
But Dr. Radford,
Right.
local dentist,
Mm-hmm.
was elected. What do you know about that effort? Who chose him to be the candidate, and how did his candidacy develop?
I'm not fully assured, knowledge-wise, as to which came first, the chicken. In some of these efforts, you kind of wonder which came first, the chicken or the egg. There was a general movement across the state and nation, I guess across the state and maybe the South, I should say, for more black involvement. And of course, the drum was beating in this way. So it was a kind of the blacks were pushing for it, and you had a number of whites in numbers of cities that felt this would be a good thing to sort of hear again, not to necessarily do what the blacks wanted done, but to relieve some tension. I mean, this is just the right thing to do, and if we can find someone who's representative of the kind of citizen that we would want black, we're willing to give them a share of the. I mean, this was a part of the thinking. So it was a push on the part of the blacks that we want a part of the rock, and it was agreement, conscious-wise, morally conscious-wise, on the part of a number of whites that they'll do a part of the rock. And this, I think this helped to make, this formed a good bit of the basis. So it was this kind of thing that you had going from both sides, that we want in, we want to share, we want a part of the share. And others who said, we think this is good, we just want a good representative. And Dr. Radford was this kind of personality.
So, as far as you recall, then Dr. Radford was not the explicit candidate initially of this Voters League.
No.
But maybe came out of some conversation between both white leaders who were moving in this direction and some black leaders, or am I putting words in your mouth there?
Yeah, right. It would be pretty hard for me to say yes or no.
All right.
Because some of these things, as I mentioned, some of these things were spin-offs of what was just taking place in communities. The blacks were pushing, we want to be first-class citizens. You had us in second-class spot. And there were whites who took the position, they have this right. They're Americans, they're black, but they're Americans, and they'll do this spot. So in this kind of thing, it's hard to tell where and who chose who, and because this is part of the spin-off of and of course, other places, what was, not only when we say this happened in this community, but when you look around the nation, maybe not during this year per se, you had the cities that were being burned. California, you had Watts burned to the ground and moved on around to Philadelphia, New Jersey, Detroit, whole communities, businesses, homes being burned to the ground. And it was just igniting all over. Even Washington, D.C., after Martin Luther King's death, fire broke out. So with this kind of spontaneous eruption, I mean, the better thinking people, mostly whites, had to come to grips with some things and say, look, these things can happen anywhere. And of course, this was not led by your black leadership. These things were erupting in spite of what black leaders had been trying to do. And of course, it was kind of amusing to me, kind of during those years, coming up to those years, the NAACP had been the bad boy. But I was called on to speak to several groups here in Waco, and we became the good boys.
Yes.
After the Black Panthers came into existence and they were shooting up different places. So we became the good guys. Before that, we were communist-based, and we were the radicals. And after all of this, so I mention all of this because it was in the light of a number of things happening that kind of woke up some of the better thinking people to give some thought to this. Maybe what the blacks have fought for is not as bad as we think it is. And then when we look at it morally, it's right.
Do you recall the specifics of any of these white leaders in the community? Do you recall any of them specifically, who they were? You may want to add others later, but were there any in the business community or religious community or political community that you recall who kind of stepped out and said, you know, we got to do something?
It's pretty hard for me. More I think of maybe two personalities in particular, and yet I don't know. I'm kind of evasive of even mentioning their names as such. One was not as visible, so I don't know how many others working along with him. Another one was maybe more visible, and yet I guess the biggest thing that most of them were doing, as I analyze it, because they conferred with us as leaders, telephone calls, and I think back to what I made mention in our last interview, the chamber, which would include your leadership, the Waco Chamber, called the Black Leadership, the preachers, the bishop at Paul Quinn, Bishop Sherman at that time, the preachers and other laymen called us together, and we met with the Waco Chamber of Commerce. So you never know. I mean, many times the white leadership had to move in quiet areas lest they be called nigger lovers. And we were always conscious of this. And as leaders, we knew that they were doing what they could do on their end with what they had to work with. And and so for this reason, there were so many, maybe not a host, but there were a number of leaders, some that that I knew personally, kind of what they were doing, and others who had to work behind the scenes. As I stated the other day, to fit in with what I'm saying here, you take when the restaurant association decided to open their doors, Piccadilly refused. But here were others ready to go because of what the chamber requested. Then let's open these doors, open these things up, and so this city can become. So Piccadilly kept her doors closed. Well, the others said, we don't want to open our doors lest we lose all our white trade to Piccadilly. So it's in this vein that. So I would just say the Chamber of Commerce, the Waco Chamber of Commerce, which includes a number of leaders from various sections.
Well, let's follow this trail of political leadership and its development in Waco. Dr. Radford was elected
Right.
city council. How did the black community respond to his election, and then later to his leadership on the council?
I would think, and I was maybe being one of the several leaders, I was pretty close to it. They responded in a gracious way. Dr. Radford was respected, was a respected citizen, businessman, and this was a thrust in the right direction. I think all this was considered, because I guess you have some people in a community that, unless they were there, unless their friend was there, they wouldn't like it anyhow, no matter who was there. If Jesus was, yes. So, but in general, Dr. Radford well thought of. Then the general thinking, I think, among what I call your average citizen, is that one individual is going to do so much. One individual on a board, a commission, a council has one vote, and that he was a step in the right direction, and we had wanted in, and this is a step in. I think this was the general thinking of what I call your average citizen. Of course, you have your militants and your rabble-rousers, unless he'd gone in, jumping up on top of the table and pounding them, they wouldn't be satisfied unless he's getting them told, getting everybody else told every week. He's not their man, but the average citizen.
All right. Now, after he had served 2 terms, I believe it was 2 terms.
Right. Could have been. I don't know whether it's 3 or not.
But anyway, 2 or 3 terms. There has been the general custom that city councilmen serve 2 terms and then do not seek re-election. But he may have served 3 terms.
3.
But whatever. When he completed that, I guess the question was, well, who will succeed him? What was going on in the black community in regard to that question? and in answering that question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess one major question among several major questions uh, would it was and were um, someone who would certainly represent our cause.
Mm.
This is always the key question: whether you're going to get a man that fits the mold that's already made, or whether you get a man who will go in and take a positive position for some of the things. You don't get everything, and I often tell folks at church, as a husband and wife, we don't get all that we want at home. So it's this kind of thing, but where they wouldn't get the black concern was and is that there be someone who will represent the black cause, the black issues. So I guess that would be maybe one of the key things.
Well, who were the people who were discussed? I'm trying to remember if there were multiple candidates or not. But do you recall any discussion about who should be the candidate from
Well,
the black community?
there were several individuals, and so many things have transpired as relates to the politics and to the wards. They've shifted,
Mm-hmm.
even the territory, because, one of the things which happened, you had an open election citywide.
An at-large election. That's right.
And anyone could be elected who got the most votes. And with that in mind, only a black could get in with the wishes of the white community.
That's
because
right.
the blacks would make up, I guess in McLennan County, we've clocked it around a fourth of the population of McLennan County. So this is what you're looking at. So to a large degree, unless the whites agree that we want to let this black candidate in, it was just almost out of the question for one to get in. And we lost out once or twice in this area. So Duconjay sort of fitted, I guess, the agreement between both groups because he was elected. But we had no hope beyond beyond that of if the white community wants this black city councilman, he's in.
That's right.
If they don't, it's going to be almost a miracle for him to. We lost several in that structure. We had Dorsey who he ran well, but he couldn't get enough white votes.
Yes. But Mr. Oscar Duconjay was elected.
Right.
And served as city councilman.
Right. In fact, maybe the image of Waco was upgraded because he became mayor.
That's right.
Yes.
And became the first mayor.
First
black mayor.
First black mayor. Right.
Of the city of Waco.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know him well? The reason I asked that is, of course, he was a Catholic.
Right.
And so I just wondered if you'd had many associations with him.
In a fashion, yes. In a fashion, no. I say no in terms that sometimes you meet individuals in these meetings, and you all are there because of kind of harmonious agreement between the issues that are being discussed, but just having a close associate with him. I think when I came, he was working at the Veteran Hospital, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, his church affiliation. And the Veteran Hospital, well, our tracks didn't cross too many. A whole lots of times. I knew he was here, he knew I was here, but as far as association, it was somewhat limited. But he had been here because he was well thought of by the black community.
What did they think of the way he performed as city councilman and mayor?
I think they thought well of it. hmm And he seemed to try to live up to the mayor part of it, being where the mayor's supposed to be at the time he's supposed to be there. So here again, we had a black councilman, one man with one vote that could do so much. I don't know. Because you may have, I guess with each councilman, you have those in a neighborhood who carry their issues and something is done about it. And another group will carry their issues and nothing is done about it, or nothing can be done. And so you always have the group that will like and the group that dislikes. Another group because they are not necessarily involved in the issues with the individual, that somewhat neutral.
Well, let's follow the development on the city council on up to the present day. I'm not certain, but I believe then after Mr. Ducanger's term that they shifted from
Right.
at-large voting so that at least the majority of the city council, though some are still elected at large,
Right.
the majority
Judge.
were elected by the voters in their particular district.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was then the opportunity for what we generally would identify as East Waco.
Right, right.
In the main, the black community,
Mm-hmm.
to elect themselves a
Mhm.
representative
Right.
on the city council. And there, I believe, I'm not remembering the names, but there was a contest, I believe. Who was the next black city councilman elected?
Dewey Pickney.
Mr. Reverend Pinkney.
Pickney.
Wasn't, did not Cullen Harris?
Right. Cullen
Ron-
Harris and, if I'm not mistaken, Lawrence Johnson, a lawyer.
All right.
I know he's been in one or two of the races.
All three of these blacks
Right.
who had exercised in some way or other leadership in the the black community and the larger
Right.
community. What do you recall about that election and the campaign and the differences between these and how the black community responded to
Mhm.
those?
Looking at the candidates and analyzing it as you see the community, a quick rundown. Reverend Dewey Pickney was a preacher and a pastor, and he had already made some sacrificial efforts in what we call no man's land to get some state and federal money to upgrade that community. And at the time he was running, I think some grants, federal or state, had already been granted, and some dirt had already been dug to lay down some water pipes and some other facilities that had been non-existent in no man's land. So, being a preacher, he had the preachers behind him. not just because he was a preacher, but being a preacher that did give him some latitude, and then because he'd made this effort, sacrificial effort, he was well thought of by maybe more than the others who had been a part of the community. Cullen Harris is a citizen who had been involved in some of the ongoings and activities of the community, but had not made that kind of thrust. And of course, Lawrence Johnson had grew up here, but he had been away in his studies to become a lawyer, and then he had worked several years away from here. So his efforts and even being known as to what he would do or could do, or whether he would do it or not, all of these were questions. So Dewey Pinckney won out.
All right. Let's talk about a bit about his tenure as city councilman. That again was for 2 or 3 terms. I've forgotten.
Two terms.
2 terms. How was his work on the council viewed by the black community?
I think you had mixed emotions about it, and yet, in a general way, it's my feeling that if he'd wanted a 3rd term, he would have gotten it.
And then the most recent election.
Right, is the woman, the councilman,
Yes.
Marilyn Jones.
Jones was elected. Who were the other candidates? Do you
Nolan, Nolan Jackson.
Yes.
I'm trying to think of his last name.
How would you characterize those two and their differences and the black community's response to them in that election?
Right. Nolan Jackson, just to give you maybe a little interpretation, Nolan Jackson had works and was working and is working at the VA, Veterans Hospital, and he had been involved in the Little League program. He coached a Little League group, and he'd been active in the Little League program. So he was well known by that group. But beyond that, this may be, when we talk about electing this individual, that individual, many times it boils down to who knows him and how well is this knowledge through the community. Marilyn Jones was working at Paul Quinn. Marilyn Jones was a member of Tolliver's Chapel Baptist Church, which is our largest membership Baptist church in Waco. Then she was a member of one of the sororities, Delta, I believe, Delta sorority. And of course her dad has been a relative. So when you get to naming these names, kind of been one of the families sort of in the center of the community. So
Right.
it's been a real estateman. So all of this was in her favor, and of course you discovered they both ran good. They both were thought well of.
All right, the other area of political leadership in which blacks have come to exercise themselves is on the school board. At least I would guess that you would have to identify that as a position of, in the broad sense, political leadership.
Right.
It was a little later that door was cracked and opened, though, for for blacks. I've forgotten the dates now, but
Right.
sometime after the first black was elected city councilman that first blacks were elected to the Board of Education.
Uh-huh.
Talk about that development and the people who have come to offer some leadership.
Uh-huh. All right, you had maybe in the early thrust of, here again, the black movement that relates to education, you had the same problem with the school board as you had with the city council. The school board members were elected the popularity at large. So it depended upon, if a black was elected, it depended upon agreement between the white community and the black community. We had a close call in getting one elected, and you just had two good men, and here again, the white community saw that overbalance the white and black united effort.
Who was the black in that case?
Yeah, Hardy.
Oh, yes.
L.F. Hardy,
Reverend
First
Hardy,
Baptist.
that's right.
And he was running against Dr. Kanapi.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Right.
And they ran a close race. I mean, they both were well thought of.
Yes.
Very close race. And so until, here again, the law intervened, the movement was made to elect by precincts or by wards, did the blacks come into their own as having a place on the school board. And let me see now. First, I said so many things have happened that sometimes you have to.
Yeah, my memory is failing me at this time.
Yeah.
As to who was elected, who was the first black elected.
I believe Robert Gilbert, I know, was one.
Was
And-
Dr.
and-
Harrison elected at the same time?
I believe she was.
All
yes.
right.
Uh-huh.
Dr. Emma
Because they had
Harrison.
two different wards there.
That's right.
Uh-huh. And I believe Gilbert could have gone in unopposed.
Okay.
Or if not, he was in the black community, so this was tantamount to being elected. You had Emma Harris had a Latin American I know were running for the same position, and that could have been maybe a white student from Baylor. I'm not positive now.
All right. Well, what about their leadership on that board, and how has the black community responded to it? Of course, we have a particularly interesting development in Reverend Gilbert's
Right.
career. We'll talk about that.
Yes.
But how did the black community respond to them and their leadership, do you think?
Well, the echoes that I hear, and of course the record bears out. I'm just talking about the record is there, and it appears that Dr. Harris was well thought of. She's been into everything in Waco, and she's one of the long-time citizens of this community, so she's well thought of. She's had good public relation with the young and the old, and the new and the old. But her record kind of bears out that she's abstained from a whole lots of votes that any of the blacks, and they're becoming more and more disturbed about it because she's there too. And so it's really a question being raised whether she's just an opportunist. She ought to take a vote, positive or negative, yea or nay. And of course, they've most recently voted on the teacher's raise. she abstained. But she's been a teacher, and inflation is with us, and she abstains. I mean, she ought to vote one way or the other,
Yeah.
for more or for less, or for the same thing the others voted for. But to abstain at this time when there's quite a debate on teachers not getting their full share of the kind of work that they, full share salary, what they're really going through now. So this is about where we are in terms of Emma Harris.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what about Reverend Gilbert? He, of course, resigned
Right,
from the board in protest,
right.
as I recall, as a way to, I gather, dramatize his objection to the direction in which the school board was going,
Mm-hmm.
its reluctance to deal with what he viewed as, in a positive way,
Mm-hmm.
with the needs of the Waco school children, especially the blacks.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that that's a debatable tactic.
Right.
And how has the black community responded to that particular incident and Reverend Gilbert's leadership at that point?
Right. Well, we all regretted this type of move. It's a general feeling that Gilbert has much to offer, but maybe in his motions of anger, sort of went beyond the call of duty.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the paper and the record bears this out. In that, he asked for the athletes to, as you say, to boycott. And I think as the press sort of investigated during that time, that was during the basketball season, as they sort of investigated to see how well the request was being carried out, they discovered maybe only one athlete in all of, black athlete in all of Waco boycotted, and it may not have been even from that request that the boycott was. So this pretty well explains how the community felt. I mean, we could say a whole lot, but in that you had only one, so you would have had enough leaders to encourage the others. We had several in our church, but I felt that here were students who were just about ready to end up their high school career and had already been offered scholarships and things like this, and for one thing or another may have been asking too much of them. I think that old statement, I often think about it, if there's any trouble, let it come in my time so that my children may have peace. Well, they're going to have their struggles, but I think that's too big a price to ask young folks to pay. So this was just about how the community felt about that type of protest.
All right. Can you think of any other, I cannot, but can you think of any other areas in terms of political leadership or any other persons in terms of black political leadership during the 60s and 70s that we need to touch on?
I can't necessarily think of.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about one other area of your life and work during this time. You've served on many boards.
You're right.
In the community. One that I know about is the EOAC
Right.
board. Talk about your work there and in any other organizations in the Waco community
Mm-hmm.
that you view as important work you've done?
Mm-hmm. We have enjoyed our work with the UAC. I think maybe my time is out to serve. Period. I'm not for sure. They did give me a 5-year award just a few days ago. In some kind of way, we have been involved, Second Baptist, certainly, with our leadership. When it first started, they had the Head Start scattered throughout the city, and we opened our doors. I recommended it to the trustees, to the deacons, and to the church that we open our doors along with several other churches rent-free. And they were there at Second Baptist, part of the Head Start program. They were there some, I don't know how many years now, 6 or 7 or more years, rent-free. They paid the utilities. And we were happy to have them there. They would have their program from Monday morning each day until 5 or 6, 5:30, thereabouts. And of course we'd move in after they moved out, or sometimes we'd be upstairs while they were downstairs. And we were happy to, the church was glad to do that. And of course with the UAC board it had quite an outreach in several directions. And it's kind of hard to point up maybe any one particular thing, because here again you had so many things to do, to become involved in.
All right, I want us at some point to come back to the church and its development, but were there other community organizations with which you have worked through the years? The NAACP, clearly, workplace, your church. EOAC, which maybe for the record we need to say was the Community Action Program for McLennan County. Are there other organizations with which you have worked, or are those the major ones?
Well, the Voters League, during the political thrust, I was a member of the Voters League, and during those early years we helped to get out the vote, and first one thing and then the other. Another organization that worked with the Waco Ministerial Association, and I believe we served as the first black president of the group. That was in I believe that was 69, if I'm not mistaken.
What's it been like working with the ministers of Waco?
I think it has been a wonderful experience. We meet just once a month, but within a year's time you get to see the fellows, and within that year you get to know some and talk with some of other faiths and other races, and some of the things that are issues that are brought in, speakers in particular that are brought in, that gives you a wide experience.
All right. There's another area I wanted to pursue a bit, and that is your association through the years with Paul Quinn College. And your view of its place in Waco in general, and more specifically in the black community. How would you assess that?
I think Paul Quinn has a unique place in the educational structure. I say this about Paul Quinn and a number of the other black colleges that are scattered over. We making our thrust on Paul Quinn in particular. There are students who, maybe for one reason or another, may not fully qualify or fit into the thrust of programs of some of our universities and what have you. And individuals who will and have made wonderful contributions. And sometimes it's that reaching out with an extra hand, so to speak, for maybe another better word, words to encourage them and bring them on. That Paul Quinn has been able to do for.
Have you had much association with it? Of course, it's a Methodist
Right.
school, and the Methodist bishop is very active in its life.
Right.
And you're being, of course, a leader in the black church, Baptist church, would present some differences of association.
Right.
But what have been your associations with Paul Quinn, if any?
Yes, well, I don't have a great hang-up in the area of that being a Methodist school, because I went to one for a year, and so I have no problem there at all. It's a college in Waco. I've been close to it for maybe several reasons. One is we've had members to go there as students, completed their work. Some of them are maybe working here in Waco, in the public school system now. Maybe not too many, but we've had this somewhere along the line. Then we've had members year after year who have been on the faculty. We had one of our very fine members, senior members, who passed several years ago now, but she served as registrar. And
Who was that?
Ms. B.D. Smith. We have another professor there now who's in the science or chemistry department, who has joined us since he was a Baptist coming to Waco to work at Paul Quinn, and he united with us. Walton, Dr. Walton. Then we have another member, just to name a few, who retired from the public school here, but who still has much to offer. He's not all that old, but he has retired from public school, and he's in math. T.J. Washington, just to name a few.
Right.
And now my daughter is beginning to work. She has already started for this semester.
I didn't know that.
Right. Well, she made this decision several months ago. She enjoyed her work at Methodist Home, but some of the hours in the position she had, she just sort of gave it some evaluation, and she thought maybe she would like to. She's still in social work, and she will be instructing and replace placement, deal with placements there for students.
All right. Another area. We talked about black leaders in the political area. And I remember in one of our earlier conversations we had we had noted the fact that I believe we noted that there weren't many black lawyers in Waco. And I don't know how you make this kind of comparison, but what about the economic leadership and economic status of the blacks in Waco? For example, is there a significant, what we would call, upper class within the black community? Shall we say super rich, really people with, you know, just an awful lot of money. What about the middle class and the lower class? How is that? How does that tend to be divided within the black community?
Of course, racial-wise, it would be hard for me to say, because you have some people, you look at him, look like he's ragged and starving. You don't know how much he has. You don't have maybe a large number here that would fit into what we call the well-heeled economically fixed group. You have some, but when you compare it racial-wise with some of our other cities, which naturally would be larger, which would give you a different ratio, you would have more per inch and foot in other places than you'd have here. I think it's been generally looked at pretty hard that Waco has been somewhat stable. There's been no increase in population and I've been here 22 years. I think the chamber was a little chagrined here, about 10 or more years ago, when they thought they should have had, because this is debatable, it's been debated now when we think about the census, but when they thought they had above 100,000 and discovered that they had to scrape mightily to come up with that number. So I'm making mention of that in terms that you've not had the growth population-wise where individuals come into Waco for employment. I think I've said earlier, our young folk, I marry them, they go on their honeymoon, and they stay gone.
Yeah.
And this has been pretty well the last few years, more than maybe some prior years. This has been the Waco story, and it's not just Second Baptist. So the population hangs around the 100,000, give a little, take a little. So it has been in this area when that you do not have here again maybe the population here as you would have in some other cities, what I would call economically healed individuals. When I got here, I think Waco, with the labor report, sort of revealed that one of the lower salaried cities, employment-wise, was Waco. Wasn't on the bottom, but it was below. So this is about
All right, let me ask you a very difficult question, because it's very difficult to even describe the past accurately, let alone the future.
right.
But we're coming near the end of our oral memoirs with you, at least for the time being. Maybe 20 years later from now, Bailey will come back and we'll do a second volume
Yes.
of your second 20 years in Waco. But as you look at the situation now and into the future, how do you see the plight, the role of the blacks in Waco? What do you see the problems, the most pressing problems to be, the most immediate challenges, and the needs that Waco needs to face up to in this area?
It is a pretty
That's difficult, isn't it?
difficult question because there are so many and so varied. And of course, with inflation in, poses even a greater question and problem to me because of what I mentioned earlier, the employment status or salary status. You kind of wonder what will happen in terms of the future welfare of a group of citizens. Of course, you always have the angle and the general echoes of against federal programs, but something needs to be done, and I know the federal programs sometimes so tied up in application and analysis and all of this, and you've got so many individuals who scrape off the cream before it gets to the bottom, which creates another problem. You're trying to solve one, but in solving one, you create other problems. But I sometimes wonder, unless we can get more industry of some sort, no various sorts into Waco, it has a, as I can see it, quite a plight. Waco is somewhat becoming a kind of retirement. I mean, even though it's a city with schools, Baylor is certainly the undergirding factor in many respects for Waco. And Paul Quinn has a small family that undergirds it, and I think this is good when you have these schools to help undergird the city. We also have MCC that has continued to grow, and TSTI. But beyond that, if we're not careful, it appears to me that we're headed towards a retirement city and center for senior citizens.
All right. Well, thank you very much for those observations and for your time this morning. We've come about to the end of our time for this interview. We appreciate your taking the time out of your busy schedule to share this with us.
All right, glad to be with you.